You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Christopher Media, let's make some noise.
Présenterons bientôt sur cet écran le premier film entièrement détourné de l'histoire du cinéma. Un toast aux exploités pour l'extermination des exploiteurs.
Les leçons de l'insurrection de Budapest enfin portées à l'écran.
Le film de référence est fortement déconseillé aux lecteurs du Nouvel Observateur. La dialectique peut-elle casser des briques ?
La dialectique peut-elle casser des briques ? La dialectique peut-elle casser des briques ? Les petits chefs morts pendant que les bureaucrates constatent.
Si les prolétaires s'attaquent aux masses médias, notre idéologie va refroidir. Même si on a le cul dans l'eau tiède. J'en parlerai à mon ministre de la Culture. Il faudra interdire tous ces films.
L'adaptation détournée du doublage a été réalisée par l'Association pour le développement des luttes de classe et la propagation du matérialisme dialectique. Un épisode pendant de l'âpre combat entre le prolétariat à gauche et la bureaucratie à droite. Quel pied. J'entends les mots dialectiques et je sors ma culotte. Et blanc dans les dents des bureaucrates.
Tu me plais pas, Larbin. Ils ont tous ton air peigninou là-dedans. Ça doit puer la Sorbonne des mauvais soirs.
La liberté est le crime qui contient tous les crimes. Ce ne sera plus une énigme pour ceux qui viendront bientôt dans cette salle.
Voir un film directement lié à l'histoire universelle où le dialogue s'est armé pour vaincre ses propres conditions.
Répugnante saloperie de bureaucrate. C'est avec tes tripes que... Et tu connais la suite. Crève, salope.
En attendant, vous allez produire et consommer.
Les idées s'améliorent. Le sens de l'adaptation du dialogue y participe. Entre autres, vous verrez un bureaucrate prévoyant et lucide préparant ses tripes. Quand la dialectique devient force pratique, les bureaucrates en prennent plein la gueule.
La dialectique peut-elle casser des briques ?
Cours vite, camarade, le vieux monde est derrière toi. Et la Ligue aussi.
The history of all hitherto existing podcasts are the history of class struggles. Comrades, I am your host, Mike White. Joining me is Comrade Rob St. Mary.
You know, the host of this podcast looks like a jerk. True, but it's not his fault. It's the producers.
Also making his triumphant return is Comrade Spencer Parsons.
Hello. I'm glad to be back.
This week we are looking at Can Dialectics Break Bricks? It's the 1973 film from Rene Vienet, which is a redubbing of the 1972 film Crush, which is also known as The Crush, and even released at one point as Kung Fu Fighting, believe it or not. Can Dialectics Break Bricks retells the story of Crush as the story of a bunch of rotten bureaucrats who have opposed the working class long enough. The workers look forward to the day when the landlords will all hang, priests will be cut in two, and the churches will be burned to the ground. We will work to untangle some of this mess. There is no spoiler warning for this episode. Spencer, had you experienced this film before I asked you to be on this podcast?
Yeah, this is actually one of the few that I have experienced before. Watched it a few times a while back in the context of bringing Keith Sanborn, who was your interview guest, to a festival that I programmed in Austin, Texas, Cinema Texas. This is a film that we, among several of, that are Mr. Sanborn's personal handiwork or that he had provided subtitles for, that we showed. So that was kind of the original context, and also had been the kind of asshole that keeps a copy of The Society of the Spectacle at all times in my backpack and another copy perpetually by the toilet.
Good place for it, I guess.
Yeah, it used to get lots of comments from people. That was part of the reason to put it there. But quite honestly, the other part of the reason was, it's a kind of nice, kicky reading that you can enter into at pretty much any page and, read for as long as it takes.
Rob, how about yourself?
I believe that you sent this to me probably in 2013, back in the old Halcyon days where I was pretty much on every single episode of this show. You sent it to me around the same time that we were going to watch Mock-Up on Moo. For some reason, I've got these two kind of attached in my head. You can go back and look at that one, and we did kind of a two-parter on Scientology. But for some reason, I thought that this and that film were sent to me at the same time, and I didn't end up watching it then because we were going to do this show. And for some reason, it didn't happen. I think either the interview guest fell through or the co-host that we were going to bring in fell through. So I believe this is like 7 years in the making to get to this point. I did watch it. I've watched it twice so far. And I have to say that after sort of the first experience through it, I like it more on the second viewing. I'm going to go back to a comment that was left on the first episode that I ever appeared on in this show. And that was from December of 2011. And I think Mike might know where I'm going on this, but it was when I did Bloodsucking Freaks, in which a comment was placed that says, "You guys really went overboard on the social commentary. So much so that this episode begins to feel like a lecture from a Marxist sociology teacher. Definitely not fun. Signed, Anonymous." So it's good to see Anonymous is back. I hear that they're working on getting a bunch of information and throwing it back out on the web if it's the same Anonymous. But I thought he would be into our Marxist sociology teacher lecture of Bloodsucking Freaks. Here, definitely, we will be talking about Marxism because I think it's kind of hard not to when you're talking about a lot of the stuff that's going on in this film.
I have to address both of your guys' first-time viewings with this. Spencer, I had no idea that you worked for Cinema Texas. My first time watching Can Dialectics Break Bricks, I went on my honeymoon with my wife. Honeymoon as in it was our first trip after we got married. We flew down to Austin to go to Cinema Texas 2000. And I remember going to that screening. It was at like a warehouse or something. It felt like I was going to get stabbed. Driving through like an alley and coming up to a warehouse and going in thinking, what the hell's going to happen in here? Opening up the door, and I can't remember. Keith was there, right? And so was Craig Baldwin. And that's where the Mock-Up on Moo connection comes in, Rob, because it would have been a perfect double feature or a third feature to this had we talked about Craig Baldwin and then moved into Can Dialectics Break Bricks. And yeah, we were supposed to have Keith on the show back in 2013. I went back 2 weeks ago and started looking at emails, and I have reached out to Rene Vienet over the last couple weeks, and he said, "Oh, talk to Keith. My Wi-Fi here in Paris sucks." Apparently, over the intervening, 7 years, they have become friends, and now Keith is okay talking about things because everything was all kind of up in the air as far as rights went with this film, with Keith's translation of it, with his version of it. And can you guys believe Rob, you didn't watch it before, but I have to ask you, Spencer, can you believe the quality of the copy that we just watched? Because the first time I watched it, it was not the best quality. Plus, it had lost its color in the CCAM to NTSC translation. And I thought that Crush was a black and white film for the longest time.
Yeah, same. Because I was too busy working on the festival, I didn't get to watch the print or the video copy that was shown back then. So I have, before this, only experienced it in exactly that way, off of a VHS. that played some havoc on some of the subtitles. So this was a totally beautiful experience, and we might talk about it later, but I actually really love the notes about the restoration and plans for more that is at the end of the end credits of this copy.
Yeah, I can't wait for that. And yeah, we'll definitely talk a little bit more about the rest of Vienet's filmography. But before we even start to talk about Can Dialectics Break Bricks, I just want to talk a little bit about the origins of this and the Situationist. 2 weeks ago, I talked about Fernando Arrabal and the Panic Movement and how that split from the Surrealists. The Panic Movement, Jodorowsky is one to say, I didn't really like what Breton was doing. He was kind of lording over everybody, and he didn't like rock and roll. He didn't like sci-fi. He was just had a stick up his ass, so we created the Panic Movement. And I think the Situationists came, well, actually the Lettrists first came splintered away from the Surrealists, and then the Situationists kind of splintered away from them. And there's a lot of history with that. And then also this being France, one of the means of getting the message out for the Lettrists and the Situationists was film and the film theory and actually taking films and doing what they would call detournement, which is the first part of that is detour. So to take something and put it on a detour and make it do something else. So this film is one example of taking a movie and making it do something else.
One of the things that I like about it, and this goes into, and I don't know if you can put this up on the show page for this, was the documentary, it was in 3 small bits that you shared with us. I think it's probably about a half hour in total that goes into a lot of stuff about the Situationists. So if you don't know anything about them, and one of the things that they were really big on, which I have done in my own creative work, is collage. So I think in some way film in this way kind of works in the same manner that they would do that, or they would take old comic books and strip the panels out and take the dialogue out and put new dialogue in. So in some way there's already sort of a precedent within their own work before they even start messing around with film.
Can Dialectics Break Bricks comes out in 1973, and by that time the Situationists had already dissolved. This is post-Situationist, and it's also the same year that Guy Debord puts out one of his many films, which was actually Society of the Spectacle. And it's an interesting way that he takes his book and adapts it for the big screen, makes a weird documentary out of his own book, and the text playing against the images. And of course, these are all detoured images. These are all stolen images. So it's really interesting to watch the 2 films back to back and see where Vienet is kind of the prankster and Guy Debord seems so serious about his message.
There's also a really interesting collision there between their methodologies, because in one way, what Vienet is doing is deceptively simpler in that he's using just one film and he's not cutting it up and changing it, for his own purposes the way that Debord does. But on the other hand, the sort of process of writing and using the available narrative here is actually immensely complicated. Amazing to me that this is something that he pulled off actually in just a couple of days, because I have to say on this watching, maybe it was because it was all clearer, et cetera. I was actually quite impressed with the way that the narrative, what we're seeing on screen, really did sustain with the conversations that are going on. It isn't just like a kind of gag to put these sort of philosophical arguments in their mouths. It is a genuine narrative and character-oriented experience all the way through. And so quite complicated in its way, even though it might seem to be a simpler gag than Debord using all these different films very beautifully at times in his own adaptation of his book, Society of the Spectacle.
I was going to say on that was part to my comment when we opened about watching it for the second time and appreciating it more. And that was because the first version that I watched was the one that Mike shared with me that was the old one, as you were talking about, that was rather beat up. And then watching the new one with the new subtitles cleaned up, it's much nicer, but also kind of getting through it the first time. If you don't know what you're going in for, it can be a challenge, because one of the things is, first off, they give you a bit of a preface at the beginning in terms of this is a denatured film, and well, what does that mean? And we're doing this, and it's, there's these slogans and various things that connect itself. But the first time you watch it through, I mean, it is so dense with reference, half of which I don't get. Like I don't know certain names. There's certain historical dates in there that I think I understand. So, I mean, sort of an annotated version of this would be great, because then you could go through and go, right, okay, I get all this. But I think if you were someone who was in that period when this was made, and obviously this film is not a conversion piece in a sly sense. What I mean is that it's not a film that's made just for the general audience to come in and go, oh my God, the scales have fallen from my eyes, and I'm now in with them. This is definitely something that was created for those. I mean, I get the sense that it was originally created for those who were in that movement, for that movement to a certain extent, because I don't necessarily know how sort of far a lot of people would have an understanding of some of this stuff. I think in terms of a mainstream French audience circa 1972, 73.
Almost 50 years from when this first came out, I have very little historical knowledge, and I completely agree. Those books that take Alan Moore's The Watchmen and go through every single panel and tell you all of the different things that are going on in each panel? I would love one of those for Can Dialectics Break Bricks, because there are so many references where I'm just like, okay, what is this? What happened in Barcelona in this year? What happened in Budapest 56? I kind of get that, but what happened in Barcelona 37? Who is this name? What is this? And there are times where it plays with that too. There's one karate fight that they have where it's like, to understand what's happening here, you need to see this book from pages 201 to 205 or something. Okay, that is completely taking the piss out of all of this stuff. It's like the movie knows that it's self-serious, even though it's trying to make something of a serious point, but also knows that it's funny. I don't know if that all comes together, but he manages to balance all of those things at one time.
There's a certain level in here of, and I don't know if it's exactly the correct reference, but it is aware of itself. And I was going to say meta, but I'm not sure if that's the correct term, but it's definitely aware of itself. It knows it's a film, and it makes certain reference to itself as a film, in which there's certain lines that I wrote down that I really liked. For example, at the end, there's one that the lead character that's left goes, they're just sick of dubbing it, so they're all acting like they're dead. And it's like after the big fight, and, it's just this battlefield of, dead people. So and it's like, I don't have enough money for cab fare or something like that. So there's this, or, don't talk like that, there's cops in the audience,
right.
And things like that.
That was my favorite. Don't talk like that, there are cops in the audience. At this point that they've already argued everything out so much.
So I just find it funny that it knows what it is and it's willing to play with that. It's not taking this distance where it's like, we're a film. What are you talking about? Like, let's come in and let's, suspend our disbelief and get into the story. And it's like, no, we're going to have fun with this.
Well, even the line that you used at the beginning, talking about he looks like a jerk, but that's not his fault. It's the producers. I mean, that's one of the first things that we have in these subtitles, or dubbed and subtitles in this version. And I should say, too, that there are many versions of this that when this was first done, Vienet used a subtitle track, and it was subtitled over the Hong Kong film that this was originally of. And then other people took the film and then redubbed it. And I have to say that the dubbing is really done very well. It actually matches up to the mouths quite a bit. And they use a voiceover at times, actually a couple voiceovers, and that will tie some things together. But I'm surprised that it isn't just constant voiceover whenever somebody isn't speaking. They leave enough room in between things so that you're able to still follow the story and digest things.
I'm going to mention that is truly an art in itself, and it was something that I noticed the way that they matched. I actually, in another life, have had some experience doing voices for anime in the United States. there is really some great intense attention on both the part of the writer and then on the part of the performer to kind of match the rhythms right so that the audience isn't pushed out of it by the change of language.
As I was taking notes and watching both versions, especially after we were able to get the subtitled version of the original film, certain aspects of the original film allow it to work. It seems to me like this movie was deliberately chosen, and there's certain things that are in the plot which, when I first tried to watch it without the subtitles, because it didn't have a subtitle version, I was a little lost. I mean, I understood that there was sort of this rival thing going on, and I remember in our email to you, Mike, you said something like, yeah, my Chinese knowledge is working a little bit here. I can kind of tell there's something going on with Koreans and Japanese, but I'm not exactly sure what's going on with the film. So I think if we talk a little bit about the plot of Crush a little bit, then that can help people to understand what the plot of Dialectics is and kind of how they use that structure to bring in these ideas and play these rivals against each other.
People are very familiar with the structure of this movie if they've ever seen Bruce Lee's Fist of Fury, aka The Chinese Connection, which is a lot of the same ideas. This whole idea of in this case, it's a Korean Taekwondo school, and there are invaders. This is when Japan has taken over Korea for a while, and then we have a Chinese hero come in, and he basically liberates or tries to liberate the South Koreans from the Japanese. And that is very similar to the whole idea of the schools that we have. And, you killed my teacher. Why?
Why did you kill my teacher? Why did you kill my teacher?
Inside of Fist of Fury, but, set here in a much more rural setting than we had when it comes to Fist of Fury, which I think is pretty urban. It's been a while since I've seen it. I'm desperately waiting for that Criterion box set to get released. I'm rubbing my hands together like a greedy little pig.
Greedy little capitalist pig.
Yeah, a greedy little capitalist pig. Yes.
Well, it's funny that you bring up Bruce Lee, because although this isn't a Lee knockoff, meaning that you have someone named L.I. or Johnny Lee or
the clones of Bruce Lee. Yeah.
I definitely had this feel in the beginning where he's doing all the poses and, fight stuff in the credits, that it's like, if you like Bruce Lee, you're in the theater for this. Like, it seems like they're playing on, which at this time when this was made, he was rather popular.
Fist of Fury had come out, I think, the same year as this. So it was, of Crush, I should say, because I think Crush comes out in 72, if memory serves. And then the detournement happens in 73. I'm not sure how much time had passed through between Fist of Fury coming out and Crush coming out, but it definitely feels like the producers might have seen Fist of Fury and said, oh, I have an idea for a movie. So yeah, our main character is not a knockoff of Bruce Lee, like you said, but yeah, he definitely, and that opening montage of him, yeah, with the poses and stuff, though he does get shirtless towards the end, but for the most part, he's wearing a very inconvenient costume of this long red coat with this scarf around his neck. And I would think, man, that would really, inhibit my movement if I were wearing something like that. But instead, he's able to jump around. He jumps from scene to scene like he's the Incredible Hulk. It's pretty amazing.
The thing that it really sets up this dichotomy between the Koreans who are under the occupation. So you've got those who are in the fight school. You've got a woman and her little brother. And then there's, as you said, the Bruce Lee knockoff character who's the liberator. And then you have basically the Japanese occupiers. Kind of the way to figure it out is typically they kind of move in gangs, except for the hero. And I think that kind of structure of that, like looking at it, really opens it up so that when they do the denatured version of this, when they do this dubbing and everything, the battle lines are kind of already there. Like there's this group and there's this group, and then we can kind of play the class struggle. So that's what I was thinking is it's very obvious that there's already political issues in this film, although they're not going to sit there and debate the finer points of Japanese occupation of Korea in here during that period. But I just thought that that was interesting that they chose this film that already had those kind of political elements in some way.
Because then how difficult is it to then recast the Japanese as the bureaucrats and recast the Koreans as the proletariat? And then we have the dialectician who's Piao Pai come in here, and again, I said the long red coat. I mean, how much more of a communist symbol can you get than now suddenly his long red coat means something else, and him as the dialectician being able to liberate them through his arguments and through all of these references that they have. And I love that the Korean school is, practicing karate, but also practicing their dialectics at the same time.
Well, it's an interesting thing because the choice of a film to detourn is, on the one hand, it's not casual at all. And on the other, especially by contemporary standards, can be taken as somewhat problematic, as cultural appropriation, using to this purpose. But one of the things that strikes me about the genre is precisely this way in which education is foregrounded within the plots. It's the education in fighting methods as well as the education in dialectics. And there are a number of lines about how, you've actually read a lot, or we have to keep them from reading, that definitely go very much more directly, I think, to the kinds of points and make the kind of plot work for the detournement better than, for instance, like an American thriller of the time. There's a way in which this particular genre expression works very, very well. And then, you get elements like the red costume, which at one point is, near the end, it's, now it's the battle of the red and the white.
How much more of a perfect film could he have chosen than something like this? He's able to take what's existing and twist it in such a great way that it just feels so natural, which is so strange that you can take a karate film and then naturally turn it into what this is. And then you can recast characters like the little boy and just his his lascivious remarks to the female character and how he keeps going back to Desaad.
In the original film, they're brother and sister, but in the redone film, he's just a pervert and constantly trying to get with his... We don't know, because we presumably haven't seen the original film, but if you're watching this version, he's trying to get with his sister, so it's kind of funny.
One of the reasons why it's funny is in part because of, what's being pulled out of these performances. There is something about the performances between them that's not exactly lascivious, but they have these expressions on their faces during these bits of detour dialogue that definitely make room for that material and might, in fact, have inspired it.
There's also a thing, 2 levels of the title. So obviously, it's referencing the moves that you see, the taekwondo moves that they're breaking the bricks and the boards and all of that stuff. But I mean, just the use of the term dialectic, which, unless you've had a philosophy course, you definitely wouldn't know what dialectical materialism is unless you've studied Marx and Engels. But just the term dialectics is about trying to find the truth in 2 different argument points, but also the use of the term dialectic, which of course is a version of the term dialogue. So again, recasting the dialogue over a film. So it's, there's kind of multiple levels in the use of that word too.
Can you break bricks with your words, basically?
And that interesting, the constant problem of, now we're really going to sound like academics, but the constant problem of praxis, like, how does the intellectual activity become a real world activity and not just stay trapped in a classroom or in a midnight dialogue?
Where is the action to this? And do you need to take the action with the fists and the swords and all this? And I do have to say that with the Japanese being the bureaucrats in this, they are always at an advantage over the proletariat because they have swords. And then you have all these people trying to fight battles against all of these swordsmen with just their hands, and they almost always lose because they're literally getting their arms chopped off in this movie. And it's just the bureaucrats have the means of production. They're the ones that have the tools and have the sword. And then I love when at one point our hero takes away one of the swords and just says, "Go put away your phallic symbol."
The other thing that I love about that, too, is there's a guy who gets hit with the sword, and he says to him, "But you said you were going to use the dull edge." And then he just laughs at him and goes, "Oh, really? You're going to trust me like that? Come on." So there's a couple of things in here that kind of remind me of the current state of affairs in which we find ourselves, in that looking at a group that obviously has power and the means to bring down violence on people. There's also a line in here which obviously calls back to almost, sadly, over 50 years ago, where he asks the young boy for the password and he says, "Watts," and let it burn, just like Watts. So, there's this connection between what they're fighting for and then also the connection to the uprisings in the cities in the 60s during the civil rights movement, which, to be honest, we're kind of seeing the second wave of that right now.
Absolutely. And there's also another, great moment that stuck out to me here with the swords, to go back to that, where, our hero finds himself surrounded by swords, and one of the villains says to him, now tell me that our power is an illusion. He overcomes the swords, but it's like one of those, it is one of those great moments of saying, yeah, there's a lot of illusion at play within the play of power. Ultimately those swords are real, and it requires some kind of real action to overcome them. And that definitely then, relates, I think, exactly to that idea of the password being Watts. And as Mike and I were talking about when I first got on Skype, this is feeling awfully contemporary to watch this right now. So this may have been, 7 years in the making, but I feel like it's not a moment too soon or a moment too late.
Just wait, this will come out in approximately 10 days. I think by then everything will be absolutely fine with the state of the world. So
it'll all be history. It'll all be nice rear view mirror kind of stuff. And this will have receded back into its proper place as a quaint artifact of another time.
The bureaucrats will take care of it, as they always do.
I love when they're trying to get our hero on their side. The bureaucrats are trying to bring him in, and they say, "If you do this for me, I'll make you a foreman." But I also love when they tempt him with, "You'll have cash, you'll have the prettiest young boys, you'll have all the opium that you could smoke," and just all of this, like, trying to bring him into their fold and stuff. These are fucking funny lines in this movie that you wouldn't expect to be as funny, because we are talking about, like, spare no one, just like Budapest, and these kind of things where it's like, oh shit, yeah, there's some real hardcore stuff going on in here. But then you also have hilarious lines like that. And also one thing that I was really happy about, it feels like there are so many things that we talk about on the podcast that were all kind of coming together in this movie. There's even mention of Wilhelm Reich. So we have the whole WR Mysteries of the Organism. So if you want to know more about Wilhelm Reich, here's a footnote. Go and check out that episode, because we have one of our characters here saying that she has been studying his writing.
Yeah, there was also a line in there that I liked, with the foreman line and things like that, obviously talking about work. There's one where it's like, "Oh, do you want to talk to your union? I'm sure they'll help you." And they all kind of laugh. Now, as someone who has been a member of several unions, I have run into that where I've got a problem and I go to the union and not much help. So it's sad, but it's true.
I don't know if this tangent might interest you guys, but like one of the things that struck me in watching this again was a sort of interesting historical problem, not just in the sense that this feels up to date, as a work that fits our moment right now, but that on the internet, we've now had a good 20 years of profusion of works that to differing detourn sources. And there's some better works that go that way, and there's lots of frivolous kinds of things where you wouldn't quite want to call it detournement, but it is definitely taking existing cultural products and changing it. And, on the one hand, sure, you might have the usual kind of fan service reworking of some Marvel product that just holds it up as, the only thing you should pay attention to, and that would be very much the opposite of detournement, while using some of the same methodologies. But, on the other hand, those like Hitler screaming at everybody in the bunker videos that there was a vast profusion of several years ago, some of those were actually quite good and really, really funny. And then on another level, I think of an earlier example, like Brad Neely's Wizard People, dear reader, I think is a kind of detournement, but it's less political than it is emotional, using the first Harry Potter movie as a jumping off place for uncovering all manner of, psychological and emotional stuff that could be buried, within that text. So we've seen a ton of this, and so that makes me raise the question, well, what does this kind of methodology do? What does this mean? And, to a very serious degree, is this kind of methodology, does dialectics break bricks? Is it in danger of simply being consumed by the spectacle and our participation in the spectacle through the internet, which couldn't have been quite imagined by Debord at the time. But if you read the work, so much of it sounds like it's describing how we live on the internet.
I'm a huge, fan is the right word. I am always interested in these products where you take an existing work and detourn it for something else. I actually wrote a book a few years ago about a comedy group called Mad Movies in the LA Connection. And there was a TV show back in, I want to say it was 86, where they would take existing films, cut them down to about 20 minutes or so, and then redub the entire thing. And they were very, very careful when it came to matching the lips and then recasting everything. They were they were so good. I mean, I'm surprised that we haven't already brought up things like What's New, Tiger Lily, which actually happened a little bit before this, which was actually 2 films that Alan cut together in order to make that. So if people tell you it's this movie, it's actually 2 movies that he cut together. And then there's one movie which, ironically enough, is being shown, I think, this month in Madrid, which hasn't been shown for years and years, which is a 1940 film called A Mustache for Two, which I found out when I was doing research for the Mad Movies book as being one of the earliest versions of a detournement, or just basically a mock dub, we can call it, of taking in that case, it was a German movie, and adding Spanish subtitles to it and making it a joke because of the Spanish subtitles, rewriting the entire plot with the Spanish subtitles. So I have yet to see that, but I actually have a copy coming on the way because now it's finally available again after all of these years. So I can't wait to see that and then try to beg someone to translate the Spanish for me.
It definitely goes along with surrealist, later kind of caught up practices and very different kind of detournement, but I think fits into that history would be like Joseph Cornell's Rose Hobart, that kind of repurposing.
And I'm glad that you brought up cut-ups, because when last time I talked with Craig Baldwin, he was actually working on, and I know it takes him years and years to do this because of his methodology, because it's just so intense. He was putting together a movie that is comparing, contrasting, cutting together, let's say, Guy Debord and William S. Burroughs, because they were doing these kind of similar things in different countries, but ultimately very similar results.
That whole connection, as we were talking about, meme culture on the internet, short videos, even just taking the audio and stripping it out of one place and then pasting that audio over a different video source, or acting out that audio. Like there's a comedian I've seen on YouTube that's taken pieces of Donald Trump's speeches and then she'll basically lip sync them, and it completely denatures them and does kind of commentary on top of it. So it's fascinating that a lot of these ideas that may have started in these art movements are now just basically considered part of everyday commentary in the world. It's not that odd anymore to see this kind of stuff. So I think that the film can be accessible in that way, although, like I said, some people might just kind of shut it off because they're not understanding the political or the references, and they think, I don't know if I can keep watching this because I have no idea what the hell they're talking about at times.
That raises like one of the questions about the Situationist project. Even this, which is a good bit more lighthearted, is sort of prey to a kind of academicism that enters into the dialectic. The way that this discourse is carried out is highly specialized. And that actually is, as we mentioned before, that's part of the plot here. That kind of fight methodology turned into dialectical specialization and training is very much a part of this. And that also makes me think of a connection in the present tense to meme work that I think is very similar in spirit to this, which is Eric Hatch's memes on Twitter and on Instagram. The way that he takes contemporary art movies, mixes them together with each other, and mixes them with, common phrases and joke structures that are used on the internet to quite often make some pretty intense and unfiltered political points. There are times where I get really depressed about my internet addiction, and I think I'm still mostly depressed about my own internet addiction. But Eric Hatch is one of those bright spots where I go, okay, well, his work is a reason to keep paying attention, and I think he uses meme culture really, really well. I mean, I'll say that, for my own part, there's a lot of meme culture that I just have no patience for whatsoever. I find it really, really interesting the way that he detournement itself and detourns meme culture in the present tense, as well as a tradition of art cinema that in the moment is like at once celebrated, but I think also needs the piss taken out of it at regular intervals. You can enjoy the work and respect it, but let's not let Parasite boss us around too much.
We keep talking about this balance of humor and commentary and, really takes us to satire, which is one of the most powerful tools that we have in our toolbox, which unfortunately just seems lost today. I mean, people keep posting satire is dead. When you see some of the things that Donald Trump Jr. might do or say, he has no idea that he's doing this, so often, speaking of memes, so often I will see something that somebody says and I just use the Spider-Man pointing at himself meme because it's just like you are describing yourself. You don't seem to realize that. And I feel like we're having satire ripped away from us sometimes just because we are in such a ridiculous situation. So there are times where it's just like, okay, I'll see something like bad lip reading or the oral knots and the way that they recast Bane in the last Batman movie. And it's just like, okay, that we still are able to laugh at things being detourned in this way, but satire feels like it's an endangered species some days.
The first person who said that to me, and it was, I believe, about 8 years ago on this show, you may be able to actually find the piece of tape of him talking about this, was when we had Bob Downey on. And we were talking about Putney Swope. And he was referencing Mitt Romney's run for president in 2012. And he's like, I don't even know if I could do satire now. Mr. Romney is like beyond satire. Now, I think, I don't even know if we could even reach a point of beyond satire. I think that, I don't even know if that's possible.
Well, what we're living through feels like especially bad satire. Like it would be dismissible as, satire that's too fish in a barrel and too obvious. The Onion recently, I have felt has been particularly good, but it's been particularly good by simply writing headlines that feel more honest or truthful rather than being a fictional exaggeration, which used to be their style. And that particular fictional exaggeration was, of course, really funny and made them very popular. But now, quite honestly, it feels like their way of writing a headline is to take an existing Washington Post or New York Times headline and simply put it in plainer terms.
There was one that I really liked recently, and it was in reference to all of the corporations that were putting out, "We stand with Black Lives" or "We stand with the protesters" statements. And it was one for Aunt Annie's, the pretzel stand at most malls. and how that, we will shoot looters on sight and, and all of this. And it was really dark. And like friends of mine were like, holy shit, dude. Like, I can't believe you put that up. And I'm like, I think it's hilarious. As a matter of fact, I had to go back. It reminded me of talking about 50 years earlier, Michael O'Donoghue's bit in National Lampoon, where it was like the Vietnamese baby book that he did about like the Vietnamese baby in the village that got slaughtered by the Americans. And just, it's so dark in its humor that sometimes it feels like The Onion is going that way. It's like, we can't, as you said, exaggerate our way into a joke. So we're going to head right into the darkest part of this and make it just, and just make you sit with it.
I guess it's the seriousness of purpose that I come back around to with this movie, and with DeBoer's work as well, rescues what could be a hopeless project of just throwing all your effort against the spectacle into the maw of the spectacle to feed it. There is, as we mentioned before, there are references to some really difficult and unpleasant stuff in the context of this particular film. And, over the last several days in revisiting, Society of the Spectacle, both, book and movie, and then some of DeBoer's later work, I am really struck by the relevancy of that work to our present predicament, and a lot of the warnings that are contained in the work. Another line that really jumps out of this movie that's repeated a couple of times, and I almost think of it as the major theme of the film and a kind of meta commentary on it, is you can't conquer alienation with alienated means. And this sense that perhaps detournement in a way is a bit of a dead end, because you're using some alienated means in order to try to conquer alienation. And that is really interesting and hard, and actually comes up again back to the way that it works in relationship to the story. That line gets repeated at kind of the most emotionally poignant moment of this particular film, between the hero and this woman who he's become attracted to, and they've just had this kind of like lovers quarrel, and now they're getting together, and he's touching her face, and then she's going to die later on in the film. I find it like really, really interesting the degree to which Vienet engages with drama and engages with emotion here, even when so much of the project would seem like a highly intellectualized kind of game.
He can do that, and then later on, the other thing that he keeps bringing up is burning the hair from under someone's arms. I have no idea what he's talking about. You can have that very poignant moment and then follow it up with a joke, and it's wonderful.
Well, and other lines like, you understand nothing, you dick bite Leninist, we're going to fuck you up. And I know that part of that, and this is an interesting part of the whole discussion, that could be as much Keith Sanborn as it is Vienet, but I'm assuming that Sanborn is responding to the structure of a joke in French and is adapting it into English. And then that brings up the whole issue of, subtitles and dubbing, which really destroy the sort of auteurist basis of cinema, because it mentions all these auteurs' names at the beginning, that all these works could be detourned. And it made me think about, oh, right, I know this is from a French point of view, but for the French, Ingmar Bergman, who's listed there, would be subtitled. And within those subtitles, you have an intervention by someone who is disrupting the kind of auteurist product that's been created. And that's a fact of art cinema that we live with.
I apologize, guys, that I put together like a 500-page course pack for y'all to read. I think I might have made it through 300 pages because there were some articles that were just way too heady, or some that I was like, okay, this makes one reference to detournement, maybe one reference to dialectics, but really is not appropriate for our discussion. But there was one book, which was Tessa Dwyer's Speaking in Subtitles, and her article about this and just about subtitling, fascinating stuff, because you're talking about dubbing and just how you have to change what you're saying in order to fit that lip flap. And when it comes to subtitling, you have to try to take things and condense them down as much as you can. And yeah, I've seen so many different styles of subtitling over the years. I've worked on fan subs over the years, and just seeing like one of my favorite things was Zatoichi Meets the One-Armed Boxer, where there are Japanese subtitles on the screen that run vertically, and then there are Chinese subtitles which run horizontally, and then you're trying to match up everything via English subtitles at the same time. It was wild. Or even some of the earliest versions of the Lone Wolf and Cub series that I watched subtitled, which were fantastic subtitles because they would actually have in brackets the definitions of words as they would show them in Japanese, and then give you definitions or give you more information about things when there was enough time to do that. But then you're working against the timing of the movie, the timing of the dialogue, and being able to tell who's speaking when. Yeah, there's a huge art to subtitling.
And one of my favorite episodes that we did, as a matter of fact, I think it might be on both. I can't remember exactly where the larger portion of talking about the subtitles was. It was when we did the 2 episodes on the films of Fukazaku, when we did Battles Without Honor and Humanity and then Battle Royal. Linda Hoagland, who was his subtitler, talked about that. We asked her about, how do you do subtitles in English for this film, and what are the considerations and all of that stuff. So that's fascinating listens. I just seem to be the guy who's sending people to other episodes. Go listen to this one. Go listen to that one. So anyway.
It's almost like you're posting links on social media for me. All right, we're going to take a break and play an interview with Keith Sanborn, the man who brought Can Dialectics Break Bricks to America. And we'll be right back with that after these brief messages.
Attention, attention. Are you a fan of MASH, one of the most groundbreaking television series in history? Then take a listen to the MASH 4077 podcast, where hosts Kenny, Simon, and Al discuss their thoughts episode by episode. They will also share with you some little-known behind-the-scenes information, trivia, and so much more. So come and find them on iTunes by searching MASH 4077 podcast or online at www.mash4077podcast.com.
It's not easy having a good time, and it's not cheap either. Every week, the projection booth brings you a new show, possibly even 2, focusing on all genres of cinema. If you've sat through the 7-hour Conan episode, the 6-hour Star Wars episode, or even the hour-long Superbman episode, you know that Mike and his co-host put forth a lot of work into researching the movies, tracking down the interview subjects, and putting together one of the best podcasts on the internet. Now I'm asking you if you can repay all that hard work by giving back to the projection booth. The show has a Patreon fundraiser at Patreon. That's patreon.com/projection booth. You can donate as little as $1 a month. That's $12 a year. At least 50 great shows and 2 terrible ones. That's the price of 2 matinee tickets. Now isn't the projection booth worth it? Once again, that's patreon.com/projection booth. Donate today. It's the right thing to do.
I'm Chris Cooling from Forgotten TV, and you're listening to The Projection Booth, the ultimate movie podcast. You like classic movies? How about classic TV? Over at Forgotten TV, I've covered everything from obscure Saturday morning TV to short-lived shows like Otherworld, The Phoenix, The Highwayman, and Cliffhangers. You can find the show over at Forgotten.tv or at all the usual podcast places. I hope you'll join me soon at Forgotten TV.
How did you get to be what you are today?
I was in Buffalo in 1978 in graduate school at the Center for Media Studies. It was kind of one of the most amazing places in the world for studying experimental film. Paul Sherritt, Tony Conrad, Hollis Frampton, the Basulkas, all kinds of people were there. It was really like being at the Bauhaus, but without the infrastructure. And during the time I was there, somebody put in my hands a copy of Society of the Spectacle. I was completely blown away by it. As soon as I could, I got a French copy, and I had the old black and red editions version. But at a certain point, I realized that the Situationists had actually made films. Well, I found out about DeBoer's Society of the Spectacle, which I also later translated and did a bootleg version of, and his Refutation of All Judgments, which I also did a bootleg translation of later when they became available. But I was already studying film, and I had studied English and comparative literature before that. This book landed in my hands. So that was the beginning of a more than 40-year obsession.
Do you see the films that you're making after you read the Society of the Spectacle starting to take on some of their philosophy?
I saw in them a parallel to what I was trying to do. I didn't want to compare myself to them, but it wasn't exactly a cause and effect relationship. There's a huge tradition in the United States of working with so-called found footage, like Bruce Conner, for example. That was a tradition that had interested me a lot. And I had already been working in that tradition. But their idea of detournement I found really interesting because it really spoke to me. I was always looking for kind of experimental film world of the late 70s was very formal. And it was a lot of times form at the expense of content. And I thought, well, why not have interesting form and interesting content? I've never been hugely interested in Godard. There's a couple of movies of his I like, but I really like the sense of plagiarism as an intellectual project that they were putting forward. And this really spoke to me as a way forward. The idea that you could have interesting form and interesting content, or that you could have, let's go further and say radical form and radical content in a film was really bolstered by their understanding of film. And of course, I never saw the films until much later. It must have been in the 90s when I first saw Society of the Spectacle. I can't remember when I first saw Dialectics Break Bricks. It was at that, the ICA in Boston had this show. They had playing on monitor there a copy, a black and white, a really bad black and white copy of Dialectics Break Bricks. And I could not believe what I was hearing coming out of the TV. Interestingly, they were alternating it with What's Up, Tiger Lily? And I'm not sure why that is. Well, there was a myth that was, I don't know who was at the origin of it, but for many years people thought that Vienet, and myself included, had been inspired by What's Up, Tiger Lily. But in fact, he's never seen the film. I saw that film there and I was just completely blown away. I really just couldn't believe it. I had read a bunch of his essays on film in the Situationist International, the compilation of their different issues of the magazine. And I knew he was somebody who was a thinker about film, but I didn't realize he'd actually made films. They talk about DeBoer having made films. He'd made a couple when he was part of the SI, but actually Vienet didn't get started on making films till after he left the SI, which was he left in 71, and the first version of Dialectics Break Bricks was made in 72. The influence is, I guess, sort of just crystallizing that notion of very aggressive appropriation of things, which got easier and easier, of course, as video came about. The age of DVDs made the golden ages of found footage movies. Translating their work as it became available to me became an extension of my project. I'd done other translations, but there's something about it, in a way, found footage films, or however you want to say them, using pre-existing material is very much analogous to the process of translation, where you are taking something which has luminous value, you might say. I don't want to go all Ezra Pound on you there, but something which stands out to you, and then recontextualizing it in such a way, or just bringing it into another context. And in a way, that's what you're doing in translation. You are bringing over into a new linguistic context something which has attracted your attention in another language. So the engagement with the Situationists, both solidified my interest in politics and film, and it also gave me a very direct engagement with their working practices. I mean, I often, when I'm just engaged in a conversation with anybody, I'll often, some phrase out of Can Dialectics Break Bricks will just sort of pop into my mind. And I so interiorize the film. The same goes to a certain extent with Deboer's work, that there's a way in which, by translating it and by reading it, it's kind of been internalized, and it's been, become part of my thinking. It's not that I haven't been interested in other things as well, but it's definitely strongly colored my thinking about film and about the world ever since I became exposed to it.
Tell me about the Situationists and how they came from the Lettrists and if they came from the Surrealists. Help me with the timeline and what are the differences between the groups.
Actually, there's a really great book by Stuart Home. It's called The Assault on Culture, and he has some very good engagement with that, although I don't think he really starts with the Surrealists. I think he starts more with Dada. One way to sort of frame it is what Deboer says, and it's his critique of Dada and Surrealism at once. He said, the Dadaists tried to destroy art without realizing art, and the Surrealists tried to realize art without destroying art. It's part of what he might call the dialectic of detournement and appropriation, although that's actually more of another thing. You have these countercurrents against whatever the received culture is, and then with all movements, Surrealists in particular, they would never admit that their project had become sort of bankrupt. So it became a little bit more of a sort of an orthodoxy. People have accused Deboer of being a kind of André Breton, who is sort of the Pope of the Situationists, as sometimes Breton is called the Pope of the Surrealists, but that's kind of an overstatement, and at least the Situationists had the good sense to disband when when the project had reached its end. There is a kind of direct relationship between the Lettrists and the Situationists in the sense that Deboer, at least, and Gilles Bollemont, who was an early collaborator of Deboer, were part of the Lettrists, and then broke off to form their own movement called the Lettrist International in the early 50s, and then finally broke with Izu and his sort of cult of personality by the early 50s there. So there's an interest in cultural critique. There's an interest in film, in reappropriating pre-existing images. A lot of Izu's work is about that. Lemaitre's work is about that. Although they tend to go more for, they're solidly in the camp of art, trying to push that line between art and life, between art as a separate category and art as a form of intervention, gradually making living an art and an all-encompassing one so that everything becomes part of this same project. And that sounds kind of like, that could go a lot of different ways. It could go into sort of an aestheticism, which they did not choose to do because they're conscious of that sort of relationship between art and politics and blurring the line between the two, that not wanting to be specialists of either, but rather to synthesize them in a way which would, in that Hegelian fashion, both surpass and cancel them, to both synthesize and cancel out each of those categories, because they were very much against professional politicians, whether they be Marché and Segui in France or Mao in China or the Lenin in Russia. They were very much against professional politicians, against bureaucracy, against the cadres. That's a little bit of the connective tissue there. And of course, the Lettrists get their start by trying to out-Dada. They were famous for having interrupted the famous Dada poetry reading. I can't remember exactly who it was now that was reading. In a way, it's generational. You have the generation of the teens in the 20s and the 30s, the 40s and the 50s, and then the 60s. The Dadaists are really the teens and early 20s, followed by the Surrealists in the 20s and 30s. Izu starts in right after the war, founds Lettrists They're working even now, but they're younger members, and they worked in the present day, but their real kind of vital period was in the late 40s, early 50s, early 60s. The Situationists are formed in 57 and last until 72. There is definitely a lineage. For example, the idea of the dérive, which is one of the textbook words you hear associated with the Situationists, this idea of exploring the mysteries of urban space. It has a lot of echoes of, say, Breton's novel Nadja, which is about exploring the mysteries of Paris, as it were. And there's one called Paris Paysan, Paris Peasant, which is another guy who is loosely associated with the Surrealists, and his book is basically, it's a sort of homage to Paris, but not, it's not talking about the Champs-Élysées and the Eiffel Tower. It's talking more about obscure, weird little shops and houses of prostitution and other things. In any case, it's sort of like unofficial urban geography, I guess you could say. I mean, the Situationists call it psychogeography, and they talk about the kind of psychological and, of course, sociological effects of the urban milieu on the way people live. So that's definitely part of that lineage, is that interest in specifically urban space and its effect upon people, how one lives in it, and how you play within it. There's definitely a lot of their sense of the idea of play. It comes from Housinger's book on medieval Europe, Homo Ludens, meaning man who plays, playing man. That's another ingredient in the Situationist. I don't think it's really ever acknowledged, but it's definitely, one of the background texts of the Situationists. I think it's written in the 20s or 30s. This idea of space and play and, serious play within urban space, as opposed to being forced into the mold of taking your assigned place in society, working till you die or retire. I mean, it's rejection of that outlook, which is part of, the famous formulation of Debord, who is, of course, quoting Rimbaud, never work. I mean, you can trace this current back to Baudelaire and his idea of the flaneur, the person who kind of just moves through urban space. He treats urban space as a kind of form of experience, I guess you could say.
How does Vienet fit into this? When does he come to the Situationists?
I believe he comes to the Situationists in 1961. He had a really interesting way of sort of being introduced to the Situationists. He had a girlfriend. He's from Le Havre, which is in the north there, on the English Channel. And it's kind of a working class town. His father was a docker, and he was even an apprentice butcher or apprentice charcutier at one point. And he had a girlfriend who happened to be Michel Bernstein's half-sister. Michel Bernstein at the time was married to Guy Debord. This woman, Thérèse, turned Rene onto the Situationist journal. And there was an ad in the back which said, "Are you young, intelligent, and beautiful? If so, apply to us." So he basically followed that advice. He wanted to get out of Le Havre, which he found stultifying. He ended up in Paris. He ended up living, I think, in the same apartment building, which wasn't exactly a glorious apartment building. As he points out himself, this building where Debord and Michel Bernstein lived, they didn't have a toilet in their apartment or a bathroom until 1970. So when they moved elsewhere, and I think he was no longer married to Michel Bernstein at that point. But anyway, it wasn't exactly luxurious living. Debord, I believe, was living on, his student scholarship, at least in the early times. And Viennet was fascinated by the Situationists and their outlook on things. He'd already had a huge taste in his lycée of Stalinism, and he found a lot of his instructors to be lovers of both Stalin and Khrushchev, which is kind of ironic considering Khrushchev was the one who de-Stalinized. But they were sort of lovers of this Russian authoritarianism. which he had an obvious distaste for, and the anarchist bent of the Situationists had a great appeal for him. And he fell in with De Boer and Michel Bernstein. He was their friend for many, many years. And I think he also found a good place within the group because he was one of the best cooks, certainly a better cook than De Boer or Michel Bernstein, from what I understand. In a way, that's how he fell in with it. At the same time, he came to Paris. He wanted higher education. He got enrolled at what's called the Langues, the Institut des Langues Orientales, the Institute of Oriental Languages. And almost by chance, as he describes it, he chose Chinese because they seem to have a kind of not overly demanding program that would allow him to maintain the lifestyle that he liked. As he became part of the Situationist group, where he remained until 1971, the year before they disbanded, he was at various times the editor of the journal or part of an editorial collaborative, especially at the end. And he wrote, a lot of important articles especially on the relationship between film and media. He had actually wanted to go to the IDEC, which was the Institut de Hautes Études Cinématographiques, the Institute for Higher Cinema Studies, which is where he went at the time. It had just opened a few years earlier. To get in there, he would have had to have taken a bunch of literary courses, spent another year at his lycée taking these literary courses, which were a pre-qualification for that. He decided to go another route, but he was interested in making films basically since he was a teenager. As part of the SI, he was basically one of the few, along with De Boer and Donald Nicholson Smith, who were seriously interested in discussing films. The rest tended to be kind of more readerly, literary types that didn't see much interest in film.
So how Can Dialectics Break Bricks come about?
At one point in his studies, Vienet goes to China, and you had basically two ways to go. You could either go as an instructor of French to Chinese people or as a student of Chinese. He chose the first because he realized that would put him in more contact with everyday Chinese people. He bailed on a job in Peking when they wouldn't let him use any current events. And he went to Nanking, which was considered the provinces at the time, for a similar kind of assignment, but they would only let him use as a text a French translation of the sayings of Chairman Mao. Needless to say, these were not what he signed up for, and he quickly left that. After that, he came back to France for a while. In 1971, shortly after leaving the Situationists, he was traveling to Hong Kong, and he dropped in on his old instructor, who had basically founded the Langues, a guy named Jacques Pampano, who opened his apartment to all his old students. And he introduced them to a lot of people in Hong Kong. At this point, Vienet is totally fluent in Mandarin, and I don't know if he speaks Cantonese as well, but anyway, on that trip, he got interested in classical Chinese film, which nobody was preserving, and also in Hong Kong action films. He found The Crush. It has another title in Chinese, which is something like Tonfist in Taekwondo versus the Japanese. That's the explanation of the original title. Anyway, he found this film, and he realized it would be perfect for detourning, and because it has the Japanese as the occupying force, which are a perfect model for bureaucrats. And he thought, this is the film that I can make my project out of, that he'd been wanting to do for a long time. So basically, what happens is he becomes a broker for Yangtze Films, which is this film company. If you see it on that new version, you'll see their logo. And he brokered their films in France to this place called Télé Mondiale. The Crush was one of those films which he brokered. Although he never got any money for it, he was allowed by the company to make a print of the film and to add his own subtitles, which they then distributed. They subsequently created this other version, which is the version that we know, which was actually done by this guy named Shra Cohen, who was a dubbing expert, along with this group there was a kind of avant-garde theater troupe known as Le Café de la Gare, which is kind of like I guess a loose equivalent would be sort of like the Wooster Group or something, or the Steppenwolf Theater Group in Chicago. They all did the dubbing for this. And one of them actually became incredibly famous. He became like one of the major people to dub films in France. He does a lot of Star Wars voices and a lot of other people. The Crush came about as Vienet being a broker for Hong Kong action movies to Télémondial in France.
How long after he did the subtitled version did the dubbed version come about?
I think about a year, because he did his version in 1972, as he says, and in the other version, it declares its date of creation as 1973. They both did incredible box office for Télémondial. But Vienet never saw any money. He was just excited at the prospect of getting film done.
What kind of audience does Dialectics actually have over there?
There were essentially 3 versions of the film. The original version, probably with either a French dub soundtrack or subtitles, which played in the suburbs, les banlieues, mostly to a North African immigrant audience. Vienet's subtitled version and the dubbed version played in the Latin Quarter, Saint-Germain. That was basically his audience. The results were incredible. They played for months to packed houses. One of the things that you need to put in perspective about this is that, if we think of kind of avant-garde filmmaking in the United States, we think for the most part, we think video now, but at the time that I was, when that term experimental film was being used, it was all 16 millimeter. This was not. There was very little culture of 16 millimeter in France. It was all 35. Isidore Izu made his films in 35. Lemaitre, Gilles Lallemand, his film, The Anti-Concept, and all the Boers films were made in 35, with the possible exception of his very first film, which was actually made in 16. These guys have essentially no money at all, and the opportunity to make a 35 millimeter film was just not to be passed up. Also, he was learning a skill, which was subtitling and how it was done at the time. So that was the payback for Vienet on this one.
Did I read right that he did this whole subtitling, the resubtitling with his message in just a really short amount of time?
He has repeated often to me he did it in 2 afternoons. I happened today to have just looked at his first version of this film, which is not available publicly at the moment. Hopefully it will be. The dubbed version definitely relies on it, but that whole big sequence at the end where the big battle is happening and there's all those voiceovers, that doesn't exist in Vienet's subtitled version. There's nothing there. So you can kind of see how it was possible. If you subtract that from the equation, then you can see how it might have been possible to do it in 2 afternoons. Also, Vienet had been the editor of a magazine, and he had a real, as he put it, he'd really gotten the bug for fine typography from De Boer. He had produced books himself, so for all I know, I believe what he says when he did it in 2 afternoons. Now, that doesn't mean the whole process took 2 afternoons, but he probably wrote it and spotted the subtitles in 2 afternoons. The interesting thing that I learned about this is that at the time we talk about burnt-in subtitles, these are literally burnt in. They actually made type that corresponded to the proper size of a 35 millimeter frame, and they were actually burnt into the film with acid. They would take a print and which had been spotted. In other words, you do a footage count and you say, okay, this title starts here and it ends there. And they would go through and actually with some kind of acid literally burn the emulsion, burn these titles into the emulsion. I always thought that was kind of a metaphor. I thought of burned in as in dodging and burning photographically, but it actually doesn't make a lot of sense with negative positive process. It's actually, you'd have to do it with an optical printer. Later on, they did a laser version of this. I don't know how this was done. after that. But at the time this was done in the 70s in France, this is how you do it. He said he actually really regretted during the course of having to move once, that he just threw away those little blocks of type that were used to burn in subtitles. But
you said that he had this idea of detourning a film before he actually had the chance to see The Crush. And I'm curious where that came from, if you know, and how long he had been sitting on this idea.
Exactly when that happened is hard to say, but certainly if you look at his writings in the Situation Internationalist journal, he talks about, this is actually kind of later on, this must be the 70s, but he does say at one point, in the past we've relied on literary methods of intervention, and now a situationist must be as capable of making a film as he or she is of writing a book. So I think he had this idea pretty early on. I don't know exactly when it developed. I imagine fairly early on in the process, because this process, the idea of detournement actually predates the Situationists. The first text on it was written by Debord and Volmont in, I don't know, maybe 1950 or 1951. So it's actually before the Situationists, or 52 maybe, before the Situationists even existed, this idea of detournement was there. And if you look at the journal, there are a lot of detournement comics, photographs that are recaptioned. Vienet also has a hand in theorizing this. There's an essay he wrote called The New Methods Against Politics and Art, where he talks about detournement comics, detournement photographs, detournement photo novels, films, radio, and he formulates that probably even in the early 60s, this idea was floating around in his head, and he was certainly interested in film before that. By 71, the idea was well planted in his mind that he wanted to do this. And the only film that he'd ever seen of this sort, he never saw the Lettrist films. He saw them later on recently, and he said with interest. But the only film that he ever saw that was sort of practical detournement was in around 1971, but around the end of the time when he was with the Situationists, he saw a screening of Critique of Separation by Debord, which is about I can't remember, 20, 30, 40-minute film. It was pretty rare that Debord's films would get screened anywhere at that point. Later on, there was the Théâtre Confiscat that was subsidized by the BBC. But at the time, it was extremely rare. These guys were really poor. They really didn't have a lot. It would be, Asger Jorn would maybe sell a painting or give them a painting, and that's how they'd put out the journal. The idea of access to a 35 millimeter screening room was a pretty exotic proposition.
How long after Dialectics comes about does The Girls of Camaret happen?
I suspect it was fairly soon after. I know he had said that on the success of that, there's a character in there you might remember, Sugimoto Miki, this woman. He got really obsessed with her, and he started brokering films from Japan as well as from China, and he bought up all of her films so that he could bring them to France. And he bought the rights to that film and then shot a couple of porno inserts, and the rest is history. He used basically the same technique, but the difference is, in this case, he owned the rights on that one, and he distributed it himself, so he saw some of the profits from that one.
I was curious where the idea of the porno inserts came from, who he actually got to use for that. I like that he's actually turning it into then a whole treatise about censorship.
Censorship was a huge deal at the time. There were a couple of projects which I think you were interested in, that, how the eggplant was stuffed and a cassock has no fly. Those films were never made. They were kind of proposed. Posters were even made as a kind of way of gathering interest, but they were told by the censorship people that there were those titles and the content, or basically the producers figured out you could not show those films in France, because in France at the time, well, you might even have to do it now, you had to get what was called a visa de censure. You had to pass a censorship board. For example, I don't know if you've ever seen Gilles Montand's The Anti-Concept. It's a super abstract film. It's a white circle alternate that kind of flickers in various rhythms with a voiceover track. And it was projected on a weather balloon. It was kind of a late Lettrist project. That did not pass censorship. So you can imagine how strong it was. I remember Brian Geisen talking about this time period, and earlier he said, the effect of censorship is that you don't even think of the projects because you know they can't possibly be published. Those two films were actually never made, but that was definitely testing the limits of censorship there. And it was a huge success. It was huge success, that film. It played for 3 months in the same theater and basically single-handedly saved that theater. It was about to go out of business. It was probably one reason why they'd agree to run it. And it was just a huge success, and it ran for at least 3 months in that same theater.
But he didn't have trouble with the authorities with it having the hardcore inserts in it?
Apparently not. He never spoke of having any problems with it. That must have been right at the time when you could do things like that. It certainly pushes it. It's also part of the function of those porno inserts, by the way, was to act as a promotion for a book that he was responsible for publishing with 1018. You might notice that under the woman's ass, there is this book that says Remocule dans la Chine Pop. It's kind of a double entendre of either ass revolution in the People's Republic of China, or you could take it as the asshole revolution. In other words, a revolution by assholes in communist China. And it basically putting it by that hardcore insert was a way of advertising the book, which was a collection of writings by the Red Guard, which was meant as the French called it sottisier, which means a collection of stupidity. It goes back at least to Flaubert, who wrote this book called Bouval and Pécuchet. And at the end of it, he has what he calls a dictionary of received ideas. And in it, he put basically all the literary and journalistic cliches of his time and political ones. And so in the spirit of that, they collected and translated a bunch of these things of the Red Guard. And it was meant as an unmasking of the Red Guard by simply repeating what they said, which is basically the same way that Mao by Mao functions, where you get a critique of Mao with in Mao's own words.
Which came first, Mao by Mao or Peking duck soup?
It's my impression that Mao by Mao came first. They're both listed as 1977, but I'm almost certain that Mao by Mao came first because on the strength of that, which was sold to TV, it basically showed on TV on the day of Mao's death. He was already a kind of known in sort of literary and boho circles, but this really put him mainstream. And in fact, the financial success of The Girls of Camaret is what allowed him to make Mao by Mao. He got these two producers, saw the film, and they liked it, and he had these more serious aspirations. My guess, if it's in the way of things, the way these usually work, first they finance the short, and then they finance the feature-length project. But I'm not sure about that. I'd have to check with him to be totally sure. But my intuition is that it's Mao by Mao and then Chinois encore, a.k.a. Peking duck soup. There's a whole section of Mao by Mao in Chinois encore. He might have been working on both projects simultaneously, and there's a whole section of Chinois encore, which is Mao by himself. And in fact, I don't know if you looked at those trailers of Chinois encore, but that's basically the title section of Chinois encore that he simply excerpted and used as a trailer. And it works pretty well as a trailer. In a way, you can see the influence of Debord there, where in Debord's films, he incorporates these either trailers or the rhetoric of a trailer, or else I think it's Critique of Separation, where he has this title which reads The Greatest Anti-Film of All Time. And then, of course, they use the trailers both in the film they use this kind of language of trailers both in the film and for the films. I don't know if he got that idea from DeBoer or he just came up with it himself, but definitely he recycled or else expanded out on Mao by Mao within Chinois & Co.
Chinois & Co. is such a different animal. Is that because he was working with other people as opposed to taking one whole film and detourning it? It is that multiple sources, as you're talking about, that Guy Debord was doing.
Those other two films are a lot more Debord-like than the first two films are. He is detouring the footage in the sense that he's using this footage, which is, meant to celebrate the great Chinese Revolution, to critique it. And he's doing that with a voiceover. The kind of voiceover he uses is much more sarcastic. I mean, in Mao by Mao, there's a kind of tone to it. You can tell it in Jack Belden's voice there. He's given it a folksy but a very ironic delivery. Debord never does that. He's always deadpan in his delivery. Here, in the delivery, both, in the versions I've seen in French and in English, there's definitely a sense of, there's a different way of doing it. He's careful to let you know that even though he's using this language that he's appropriated, that he's kind of leaving it in quotation marks. He's letting you know that, in fact, he's not subscribing to this. Although with Mao by Mao, I suppose you could get a little confused if you were a diehard Maoist. It would be maybe stuff that you would rather had not gotten out in a certain kind of way. But, I mean, it doesn't really look like a Debord film, and he goes a lot crazier, I think, than Debord does. But there's definitely more of a relationship between the kind of essayistic style that Debord uses in, say, Society of the Spectacle and, Chinois & Co. Well, let's call it Peking Duck Soup. They're a little closer than The Girls of Camaret or Dialectics Break Bricks. In Dialectics Break Bricks, he does not change a thing. He only adds the subtitles. If you look at him, shot for shot, they're the same movie. I was noticing today, as I was looking at that version of The Crush, which you sent me a long time ago, it is longer than the version of Dialectics Break Bricks. But there are many, many different versions of The Crush. It was released in Germany. There's an English language release. That appears to be I don't know any Chinese languages, so I don't know if that's a Cantonese or a Mandarin release that you have there. But I have noticed small variations. I mean, there's a difference of 5 minutes between those two. Now, it could be just, transfer fee, but I have a feeling that there are some shots that got dropped out for one reason or the other in the version that Dialectics Break Bricks is based on. Now, I know that both versions of, I'm fairly certain both versions of Dialectics Break Bricks are based on the same print. What happens was Vienet would buy a print, and then they would strike an internet from that, and then they would make prints. They would get the tracks as well, the separate dialogue and music tracks. That's how they would, that's how things are mixed at that time. Where if you bought a foreign language film, it would be mixed down with maybe 3 tracks. Effects would be on one track, music on another track, dialogue on another track. So the foreign distributor could dub it and remix it and just, eliminate the original language track. I got the sense watching it today that there might be some small differences, but the problem is, of course, that, prints get shown, they get mutilated. In 35, every time, they build up a print onto one reel, which they do now, the ends of the leaders get cut off. Or every time print is shown, there's potential for it to break down. And that print of Dialectics Break Bricks, the subtitled one, well, both of them were shown multiple times. So the fact that there's tiny discrepancies between those isn't unexpected. The 6-minute difference, I would say, just has to do with that was the print that Vienet happened to buy, and it was shorter than that other one.
What happens after Peking Duck Soup? Why doesn't he make films anymore?
Peking duck soup really got trashed by the press. It was not a commercial success. It got trashed mostly by French Maoists, who essentially controlled journalism and controlled most people in the universities in France were Maoists, or they call them Maolacs, Maolaters, like idolaters, only Maolaters, like Stalinolaters. That's the one thing that, you want to hear him get angry. He never goes crazy, but, he has many, many examples, of how he basically was kicked out of a research position at INA, where he was collecting films, Chinese films and literature. He got kicked out twice for his sort of anti-Maoist attitude. My guess is that that's the reason. And after that, he had to find another way to earn a living. So he ended up going to Taiwan and becoming a broker for, wait for it, nuclear fuel from France to Taiwan. He is a firm believer in their nuclear power, unlike people like Rene Vienet, was one of the enragés. And a lot of the Situationists have become very écolo, very, green ecologists. What he saw was that in Taiwan, the French had really blown it, and they had a lot of opportunities, not only for business, but for cultural relations. He did a couple of really interesting things in Taiwan. One was, brokering nuclear fuel to the reactors there. The other one was he helped create a Taiwanese version of the so-called morning after pill. And he got it produced there very, very cheaply. He also saw to it that it could be produced in France very, very cheaply. It's amazing that what in Taiwan a woman can get for a couple of dollars, if it were in the United States, besides the cost of the doctor visit, the drug costs $50 or $100 a dose. So there's a pornographic profit margin involved there. Some of his other activities are also, he's a publisher. He's had a couple of publishing ventures. One was called La Bibliothèque Asiatique, which is mentioned, you might have noticed in The Girls of Camaret, which, by the way, he always refers to as une petite culotte pour l'été, which you might have noticed at the beginning, in the first few moments, it says, a pair of panties for summer. That's how they advertise the film, and that's how he thinks of the title of it. Although, it's become known in English, I guess, thanks to my translation, as The Girls of Camaret. But part of the advertising campaign there was just a picture of a pair of panties, and there was a voiceover with it, and that became that packed him into the theaters. Anyway, he published a lot of books. La Bibliothèque Asiatique. They're books on contemporary China and historical China. He's also had activities as a historian of photography in China and of Chinese art. And when I say photography in China, the first photographers in China were not Chinese, they were English. And he has seen to it that the work has been collected and preserved, and he's had it very rare prints transferred to Chinese and Taiwanese collections. It's not just a business thing with him, it's a cultural understanding, and I would say a love of Chinese culture. So he's had a lot of different ventures. He basically said, well, why did he stop making films after that? It was sort of financial necessity. That one kind of crashed and burned, and it was pretty expensive. And also, it's not one that packed him in. If you think of the 1977, you have the height of Mao worship in France. You have Godard, who declares himself a Maoist. That film, which I think is really an amazing film, I'm sure it'll be released eventually with a good picture as opposed to the piece of crap that's, circulating now. But that basically shot down his film career. He does have at least one more film he'd like to make. I don't know if it'll ever get made, but it's basically on the French Revolution. And he sees the bloodiness of the French Revolution and the vast numbers of people sent to the guillotine and the terror as being the source of modern terror, state terrorism, both in Russia and in China. And he wants to kind of expose the roots of state terror in the French Revolution. I don't know if he has a title for that project. That's the film he would like to make now.
Tell me when you and Rene finally meet and what happens there.
I was asked by ProArts to do a little lecture on the Situationists and on my own work. And they had some stuff from people in the Bay Area. They had some additional material from various people. The guys who did Call It Sleep, Isaac Cronin, he has a bunch of stuff. There's a whole group of people who collect Situationist material. And obviously Isaac Cronin was one of the people who was most influenced by the Situationists, made Call It Sleep, and he had contributed material. They asked me to do a lecture, and I showed some of my own work, and I did a lecture on the Situationists, and in particular on Dialectics Break Bricks. A year later or so, there's a guy named Mehdi El-Hajawi, who was a really amazing collector of Situationist material. He had contacted Vienet, and they had a version of Dialectics Break Bricks, which somebody else had done. And they showed it to me, and I had to, in all honesty, say it wasn't very good. Mine is better, and you should use it. But the difference was they had it in color. So this put me in touch with Vienet through Mehdi. And Mehdi was the one that sort of got all of us talking to each other. I had known Mehdi. I had met him through Tom Levine when I was teaching at Princeton, and I had been to his place. He was living in Philadelphia at the time and seen some of Mehdi's Situationist collection, which is amazing. Well, Mehdi had since moved to San Francisco, which is where he had, in Oakland at ProArts, he had come up with the show. It's basically his collection of Situationist material, which is substantial. And they wanted to do a film series. Having seen this version they were going to use, I said, let me take another shot at it. And so I looked at it, and I started putting my own subtitles back on it, and I realized that I had gotten a bunch of stuff wrong. And I could listen to it again, and I was given at one point a not entirely accurate transcription of the dialogue, which I could use, which was really helpful for things like, there's this guy, Carol, it's in English, K.S. Carroll. But there are so many homonyms in French, I could hardly tell if he was talking about Escarole or somebody, I had no idea. And there's another guy named Jean Daniel, who they mentioned. I thought it was Jean Daniel something or other, because that's a typical form of a French hyphenated name. Well, it turns out this guy, Jean Daniel, was a correspondent for Le Nouvel Observateur. One of the differences between the translation that I did last year and this year is the fact that the internet existed. When I did the original one, I couldn't just do a Google search on some phrase and have it come up. I was doing it all by ear with the help of a woman who's now a pretty well-known filmmaker named Nathalie Berger, who was helping me with it. And I would show it in San Francisco. I'd actually originally made the translation for a show at Exit Art. We did the best we could with it, but I knew about the Situationist. She was a native speaker of French and could give me some, could help out with some things which I wouldn't have gotten, but there was still a lot missing. And this time I had not only Rene Vienet at my disposal, but Donald Nicholson Smith and a woman named Nicole Brenet, who was a fantastic, she is really critical to the revival of Vienet's work. She gave him a carte blanche at the Cinematheque, and he showed his work and then a couple of other films, one on Hu Jie, a Chinese graphic artist and I believe filmmaker, and a film called Ne laissons pas les morts enterrer les morts. Let's don't let the dead bury the dead. But it's basically a film which uses Nazi propaganda films and other films in a kind of dialogue with no commentary. And it's supposed to be very powerful. It's by Ehrlich, Bergman, and Nowitzki. But I believe it's Novich. He actually subtitled that film. He's a real champion of the film as well. He's done a lot to try to get people to show it and stuff. I basically met Rene through Mehdi El-Hajawi. He put us in touch, and that's how I came to know Nicole Grenet. And I had met Donald Nicholson Smith a long time ago, but 10 years ago maybe, but I'd not really kept in touch with him. And this was an occasion to renew that friendship. Donald Nicholson Smith was the translator of Peking Duck Soup, as well as a version of there was a book, a kind of comic book that was made based on the original subtitled version of Can Dialectics Break Bricks, and it was translated by Donald Nicholson Smith. They've been friends for a really, really long time. As you may know, Donald Nicholson Smith was part of the Situationist International. They stayed friends even after a bunch of the people in the English section or the British section were excluded, as they say, for God knows what unpardonable offense. They've known each other at least since the 1960s. I got involved because I knew Mehdi, and he, had told me about this project. And I, of course, it was taking place at the same place where I had done a thing the year before. So I got very curious. And when I realized he was in contact with Vienet, I was copied on these emails, and I looked at the material and I basically said, this translation is not very good. It needs to be improved. And I offered my services, and I spent hours and hours and hours again trying to get it right. And I think we've arrived at a pretty good place now. I had Nicole to work with, and I have other French friends that I could, it's really great now that I can say, oh, what is this? What's going on in this clip? And I can send them the clip by email. Before that just wasn't a reality. And so this version benefits not only it benefits basically from digital communications, because I've never met Vienet face to face, so I've listened to his voice in recordings, and, I've corresponded with him extensively. Anyway, so electronic media basically made this, new version possible in several ways. The original version of Can Dialectics Break Bricks that I did was done with the subtitles were done on an Amiga computer and videotape. The advent of digital editing just made precise, if you screw up when you're using videotape, it's tricky to go back and correct your mistakes. It's a lot more involved process than it is to do it when you can precisely to the frame with utter accuracy place the subtitle, go back and change it, and it doesn't cost you anything. If you go back into an editing studio, that's going to cost you more money. This new version, in a sense, was made possible by, the miracle of digital editing, the internet, and a network of friends and that who could connect me up with Vienet. And also, really, his attitude is the best possible thing, that he's incredibly open-minded. He's thinking about his legacy. I guess he's in his early 80s now. And he wants to be sure that he leaves behind him a record of his activities.
Tell me a little bit more about this revised version of Dialectics. Where can people, or when can people see it? And are you working on restoring his other films as well?
The revised version, it was shown in New York at Light Industry, and it was shown in Binghamton at University of SUNY Binghamton. It's not generally available unless somebody wants to. They can approach me and I can arrange a rental. It's not available either for streaming or as a DVD, but that's the aim, is to put it on a high quality DVD or even a Blu-ray, make a box set of, the complete works. There's a group of people that have been trying to help them apply for money from the French government's cultural funding, but so far no success. Interest, but no success. Who knows? He may just barrel ahead on that one if he can't get the government funding. But they want to do 4K scans of the best available material, which is there, and they want to create a box set that will to have subtitles in English, Spanish subtitles have already been made for pretty much everything. Although I have to say that with Peking Duck Soup and Mao by Mao, those are films which work better with a voiceover. They just do. It's hard to tell because the picture quality is so crappy on Peking Duck Soup, but there'll be a multi-soundtrack version. There's already well, of course, the original French version. There's an English version. There is I don't know if it's Mandarin or Cantonese version. There is a Yiddish version. I think there will be a German version and an Italian version, at least of Dialectics Break Bricks. The ones those subtitling projects, the ones that exist right now for Mao by Mao, for example, are the Yiddish, the Chinese, the French, and the English. And those exist. Those are in the can. That can easily be done. It's just a matter of making a 4K scan and getting a good quality of it and then authoring the stuff, which is not that hard to do. Peking Duck Soup, I think, only exists in the French version and the English version. There might be a Chinese version. I would suspect there is. Can Dialectics Break Bricks exists in a Chinese subtitled version, a Spanish subtitled version, an English subtitled version. There's several different English subtitled versions, but the one I did recently, is probably the best one. There is going to be a German subtitled version. It's in progress, and there's going to be an Italian subtitled version. And there's going to be a Portuguese subtitled version. There should be a Portuguese subtitled version as well. With a properly authored DVD, you just select the subtitles you want, or a Blu-ray, and it's not that hard to drop them in. And we've organized everything so that everybody's going to be on the same page with, the subtitling files, so we can just drop them in, and it should be a no-brainer. Of course, it never is. I believe it's going to happen. That is the plan. When exactly that's going to happen, who knows? It could be this year, it could be next year, it could be later than that. I'd hope it would get done in the next year or two, but I don't exactly know when that's going to come out or who's going to publish it. Also, if you know anybody, or if anybody listening to the podcast is interested in doing the comic book version of Dialectics Break Bricks, he's looking for a publisher for that, an English language publisher. I think he has a French one. And there's also, by the way, what he calls an animated version, which is essentially a kind of Dialectics Break Bricks. And it is a rotoscoped version of the entire film. You get a very different sort of perspective on, and by the way, that uses the dub version with, currently with English subtitles. It showed at Rotterdam, and I think it showed in Madrid. There was a big retrospective in Madrid, organized by Carlos Prieto, who did the translations. I worked with him on the Spanish translation of Dialectics Break Bricks. If somebody wants to see the films, you can invite Rene there, and finance his airfare and things. And there are at the moment some economic hurdles to the work getting out, but for anybody who's interested, it is possible. There's going to be a screening at Experimental Film Festival in, I think it's in Lisbon. That's going to be in the fall, where the work's going to be shown. And I think it's going to be shown in Germany and Italy as well. So it's getting out there, but right now it's kind of on the film festival circuit. There's definitely a desire to make it accessible. It's just the opposite of wanting to fetishize things. On the other hand, he wants better quality. I mean, the versions that have appeared in various languages of Dialectics Break Bricks are just not very good. It's ironic, in the process of helping with Carlos with the Spanish version, I realized that he was in part relying on a previous Spanish version, which was relying on my English translation. And so it repeated some of my mistakes. So it's really funny to have that kind of loop back to me, that my mistakes had been repeated in another language, and that they were coming back to me. So, he basically wants to filter out the less good versions of the thing and get it accurately translate it, and move on.
What are you working on these days?
This has been pretty consuming. The other projects I have in line is Peggy Alwish and I did a film called The Dead Man a few years ago, the kind of 40-minute narrative film based on a Georges Bataille story. We have a 4K scan of it. I'm supposed to be doing the color correction for that, which I need to get back to. I'm also, for about 10 years, I've been working on a translation of the autobiography of Esther Shub, who was a Russian filmmaker who worked from the 20s to the 50s. She is, in some sense, I won't say the inventor because you can always find an earlier precedent for something, but she's one of the earliest practitioners of the full-length compilation film, or she might say archive film or essay film or detournement film. Her best-known work is Fall of the Romanov Dynasty, at least in the English-speaking world. And frankly, there are not that many people interested in her work, even in Russia. I was kind of shocked to find the degree of disinterest there. There are other scholars who are interested in her work, and she made about 8 or 10 features, a bunch of shorts, maybe 20 shorts, and innumerable newsreels over her career. I've been slogging away on that, and my Russian's not nearly as good as my French, so that's, unfortunately, I do have friends who can correct my more crude mistakes on that. And finally, I'm working on a couple of my own projects, which have been sitting in the back of my mind for a while. I have an audio project where I've collected a massive number of versions of Mac the Knife, and I've started the project of superimposing all of them so that they're all playing simultaneously in this kind of weird, sludgy, multi-channel mess.
Keith, thank you so much for your time. This was wonderful talking with you.
Likewise, I'm sorry this is a little less coherent than I would have liked it to have been.
On guard. I'll let you try my Wu-Tang style.
All right, we are back, and we were talking about Can Dialectics Break Bricks? And I just want to talk a little bit about some of Vienet's other works. I am really looking forward to the day that I can see a restored version of The Girls of Camaret, because it is what we see is fantastic. And I really can't wait to be able to see this in much clearer form. Now, again, The Girls of Camaret, it's actually 2 films. A lot of people will say that it is Terrifying Girls High School Lynch Law Classroom. Talk about an amazing title there. That it is just that movie. Also, it uses the opening credits for whatever reason, because there really aren't that good of opening credits, if that makes sense. We don't take a break in Terrifying Girls High School Lynch Law Classroom to have like a whole title sequence. So Vienet actually picked up the credits from Female Yakuza Tale, Inquisition, and Torture and used that credit sequence in order to then introduce the film and say that this is a detournement film and give a little bit of an introduction there. And then for the rest of the time, we're pretty much watching Terrifying Girls High School Lynch Law Classroom, but we are also getting inserts of, we're getting inserts of a lot of penises, basically. Not only are we playing with this Japanese pink film, but we are also making it into more of a pornographic film and calling attention to this being pornography, and where does pornography fit into the world, the idea of censorship, and really Girls of Camaret becomes this screed against censorship and also laying the blame at us, the viewer, because we are the ones who have standards and apparently impose censorship upon films. So it's playing with all of these different things.
I did not get a chance to watch that. I did not get a chance to see anything but Crush and Dialectics twice. So I'm going to put myself over to the side here and just say yes.
I confess I know of it through what you've just told me and by its reputation, but that's not one that I have seen seen before, even in this case, because I took my time to dive into the book about subtitles that you mentioned before and back into the De Boer. So that's really something to look forward to, though. One of my favorite surrealist films, The Spirit of the Cypress. This is one of my all-time favorite surrealist films, is doubly surrealist. So it was a surrealist who wanted to make a dance film called The Spirit of the Cypress, which is, this kind of dance around a cypress that's, in a really beautiful place. And it's a kind of fawn and falling in love with this woman and whatnot. It's like, it's one of those like 1920s kinds of things. But then somebody decided to interpolate right into the middle of this, because you never see the faces of these dancing figures particularly well. They interpolated like a hardcore porn insert. I have no idea from where, that goes right into the middle of this like, it's supposed to be a beautiful lyrical kind of thing, and then compounds it with another insert. And this is where it becomes my favorite. It's not just that there's like porn cut in, but there's this little boy looking through some bushes at them. And he says, "Oh, not again." And as soon as he says, "Oh, not again," then it goes back into the rest of the normal movie, the original Spirit of the Cypress. And the screening that I went to, it's really funny. The programmers who had done it, they didn't realize that they were showing the version with the pornographic interpolation. So it was this wonderful surrealist prank that had moved forward 80 years into the future, that this film was still pranking people. And it's one of my favorite movie-going experiences ever. And I've tried to get a copy of it, and I thought it was on one of those Treasures of Surrealism discs. And it turned out that it was the version without the pornographic interpolation. And that's kind of fine enough to watch on its own. But it's just like one of those things where the interpolation of extreme content actually does open up works in really interesting ways. And part of why this was exciting wasn't just that it pranked the audience. It's also that it brought out something that was in the original, surrealist dance piece, which was that it is very sexual, but it was trying to play it all through, mythical ideas, Greek mythological sort of, high culture notions. And to have this low culture inserted into the middle of it was really great. And I think, that's what makes it worth discussing in this context.
I have this image in my head of that scene from Fight Club, where he's working in the projection booth and...
Why would anyone want this shit job? Because it affords them other interesting opportunities. Like splicing single frames of pornography into family films. So when the snooty cat and the courageous dog with the celebrity voices meet for the first time in Reel 3, that's when you'll catch a flash of Tyler's contribution to the film. Nobody knows that they saw it, but they did. Nice big cock.
Which, anyway, wouldn't actually work because one frame, as we know, is not enough to really get your eye long enough. But anyway.
I also want to say that there are other films out there that, I mentioned Guy Debord has had several films. There was one that he made, I can't remember the title, but I remember Desaad is in it, in the title, not in the movie. He's not in the movie. It's one of these torture the audience type of films where when people are speaking, you don't see anyone on the film, if memory serves. It's been a long time since I've seen this. When people are speaking, the film is black, and when they're not, the film is white, or I might have it reversed. And there's one segment towards the end that I think is just 20 minutes of black film, and then it ends. And so people were coming out and we've talked about movies and artwork causing riots before, but this one almost caused a riot in the movie theater kind of thing. And people just screaming, don't go see this, don't waste your money. But this was a screening in London of this film, but people had driven all this way to see this movie because it was supposed to have this reputation. And they're just like, no, God damn it, I'm going to go see this movie. And then they go in there and they just felt like they were fucked over. So it's kind of a prank, but kind of not at the same time. And yeah. And then also, Debord, was part of the letters movement before it became the Situationist. And the Letrist also had a lot of films. There's one called Venom and Eternity, which they kind of took to Cannes, I want to say in 51, 52, something like that, and basically forced it to be shown. It ended up getting some sort of a prize, but it was this real big controversial movie. I had read different things. I heard one version was 4 hours long. The version that's out there now that you can find is only 2 hours and 3 minutes long, but the 3 minutes is enough to kind of get the idea of it. There's also one called, basically it translates to Has the Film Already Started? It pretty much uses different title sequences, and there's writing on the screen, and it just fucks with the image, and it does that for I'd say about an hour. And so the title is very appropriate as far as, has the movie actually started yet? Because we just keep going back to title cards for the movie as if it were starting. It kind of reminds me, and I'm sure somebody's done this. I haven't seen it yet if they have, but sometimes there are, the opening credits to films, they will have the production company logos, and some of those are so ornate, let's say, so obsequious that you don't know if you're watching the movie now or if it's still the production company logos. And there are so many movies now that have so many production companies behind it that you can watch logos for a good 5-10 minutes before the movie actually starts. I'm sure somebody has taken those and combined them all together in order to make an entire movie of just production company logos, because some of them are gorgeous and some of them are horrible, but my God, do they go on for a long time.
I was reminded of, and this is more of a short film, but Too Many Cooks. I don't know if you saw Too Many Cooks. Oh, God,
yes.
Where it's basically the opening credit sequence of a show, and then it goes on and on and on, and it goes through a series of different genres, while at the same time there's a killer that's trying to kill everyone through all the TV shows.
That killer shows up in the last, not the second Jumanji sequel, but the first Jumanji remake, the one with The Rock, but not the one with Danny DeVito. He shows up at one point in that movie. It took me so out of the movie because I was just like, oh my God, it's the Too Many Cooks guy. He's going to kill everyone.
I think that also gets into a contemporary form of detournement, and one of my favorites of that form. Adult Swim has funded a lot of this work, and there's one in particular. Unedited footage of a bear is a really interesting example of this. It starts off as some footage of a bear that then gets interrupted by an apparent, internet advertisement. But the advertisement, which is for, some kind of new Prozac-esque knockoff, goes on, and it's listing all these potential side effects that it could have, as the woman who is the lead character in the ad goes through an experience of a kind of horror movie breakdown over time in it. And this sort of merging of comedy and horror. There's another one, another short film, Great Choice, that works a similar kind of game with a Red Lobster ad that looks, it looks to me like it was found footage right out of the gate, and then it turns out that it's not found footage. And I don't want to go too much farther and spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it. It's kind of an amazing recreation, both parody and detournement of the work, and that these are some really, really interesting movies that are being made that use these methods or are inspired by those methods and do some very, very strange things. I think it's interesting, just as we're talking about it, I'm realizing that this is a much more common language than I thought when we started talking about it. And I thought it was a pretty common language at that point, too.
I think a lot of it has to do with when we consider as far back as hip-hop, the idea of sampling and then using samples and bits of things to create something new. I mean, granted, collage has been around for so long. I mean, probably my first experience of collage in a show was probably watching Monty Python when I was a kid and all of the Terry Gilliam animations. But I mean, the idea of cut up and collage and that, but I mean, just the explosion of the ability of people to be able to do it themselves nowadays with just a cell phone. I definitely have to say that this is probably, it doesn't even seem to be something that we need to explain. It almost seems to be the water in which we all swim in.
Well, and maybe that recommends this as a far less obscure or specialist kind of film than we might have thought.
I think the only thing that makes it specialist is understanding what they're talking about. You know, like you have to have some working knowledge of, I guess, like student uprisings in France and, you know, sort of European socialism. You have to have read at least the Communist Manifesto, maybe Das Kapital, in order to get some of these deeper references.
Vienet also made a movie called alternately Peking Duck Soup or One More Effort, Chinamen, If You Want to Be Revolutionaries, which I think is a line from Desaad, speaking of something else that you should probably read. And that one is closer to what we've been talking about because it uses many sources, and it's using newsreel footage. It's also using clips from movies, and it just is this incredible hodgepodge of all of these things put together. But unfortunately, you know, I said how the Girls Cabaret really could use a facelift. The versions of Peking Duck Soup, I have yet to see anything that, well, it's like probably 5th generation VHS, maybe more than that. You know, it's been a while since I've seen a really awful VHS bootleg, but unfortunately, Peking Duck Soup is one of those. It's pretty bad. It uses so many different sources that it really starts to get into that collage work. It starts to get more into that Bruce Conner, Craig Baldwin territory where you are using clips to emphasize points. And it is even doing some interesting flash cuts in there to a couple kung fu films. And again, talking about maybe being a little bit over people's heads. I mean, I know a little bit about Chinese history, but I do not know nearly as much as Vienet, who's an actual sinologist, and they're making references to so many things in this that I'm just like, okay, yeah, I know Mao, I know Chiang Kai-shek, yeah, I don't know most of these things that you're telling me, but it's a very interesting watch just to sit down and let it play and try to figure out what the fuck is going on.
Man, we could go on forever with the references to other stuff, but I do think that it's necessary to bring up Bertolt Brecht, who is name-checked within Dialectics Break Bricks at one point. There's a way in which this is following somewhat the kind of Brechtian pattern of trying to create an experience for the audience that is delightful, but not so delightful as to prevent them from, you know, having a learning experience, like learning the sort of political and structural analysis that Brecht is bringing to bear, for instance, in one of his plays, or that you know, the situationist ideas that are being brought to bear here, you know, wanting to make sure that is something that you can learn while also providing enough entertainment value. And, you know, of course, there's that great Brecht quote, the proof of the pudding, the proof is not in the pudding, the proof is in the eating, you know, which is very much about like trying to create as much as possible a pleasurable experience. And that makes me think that perhaps along these lines, a more, at least not successful in general terms, but successful for a wider audience kind of experience might be the work of George Romero in his Living Dead movies. I would say particularly Dawn of the Dead, which, if you watch, does quite a bit of, Marxist critique of society, but really embeds it within a horror and action kind of setting.
That's what I would always call sort of the dual levels. This was the thing that was always so great about a show like, for example, The Simpsons. There were things in there that if you were read enough, you would get those references. You would understand what they're talking about. But if you just watched it as a straight show without getting into that stuff, it could be enjoyable that way too. So there was these sort of multiple levels. And to me, that's the kind of work that I've always been interested in. And that's the thing where, say, for example, if we talk about mass audience interest, we're talking about Can Dialectics Break Bricks? Like I said, this film seems to be, at least in its use of those references and all of that, it's talking to a group that would understand what they mean, as opposed to try and take those ideas and put them into the plot so that people could just enjoy a kung fu movie, or they could see it as a kung fu movie that actually has a social critique in it. to me, Mad Max Fury Road is a great action film. You can enjoy it as an action film, or it's really about all of these other things.
Bringing up The Simpsons, there's a clip now going around from that Henson show, Dinosaurs. And it's become a popular clip in the last couple of weeks because it's the dinosaur family watching this show, Triceratops, where the cops are apprehending, someone who they've been chasing, but they stop and they do a Marxist explanation. I mean, truly Marxist. It's not reading anything into it. It's like a full-on Vienet style dialogue between the cops explaining to the criminal who they're apprehending why he's a criminal within the given social structure and the work that actually needs to be done.
I surrender. We're not gonna shoot you. They want to re-educate you. You see, son, you're just the product of an alienated economic class, lashing out because you feel powerless and unloved. You've been disenfranchised by the bourgeois power structure. That's right. I stole a car. I'm a thief. Well, son, if you think about it, all property is theft. Oh. Let me explain how the surplus value of the worker is being exploited in the marketplace. You see, when the means of production...
we made a few changes in the shows.
Ooh, I feel this creaking in my head, like an old rusty machine that hasn't been used in a long, long time.
You can kind of guess why that's a clip that's become really popular going around Twitter right now. Really resonates again with our current situation. And that's a show that was, canceled after just a couple of seasons. Though one of the great things about Dinosaurs and its cancellation is that show pulled a radical move in saying that the dinosaurs were responsible for the end of their own world. And it really did, in the final episode, it didn't just leave off with these characters we've loved. It killed them off in a mass extinction that was their own fault.
It's been a while since that show was on, or I've watched it. I think it was on when I was a kid, and I remember kind of seeing it from time to time and looking in on it and going, it's kind of like the Flintstones.
Yeah, the Henson people were not messing around. And maybe this Marxist turn came up because of cancellation. I think it's quite possible that once that they might have gone radical because they had been canceled and had really nothing to lose as long as they met up with network standards and practices and just delivered whatever they wanted to do through the last several episodes.
After you watch Can Dialectics Break Bricks a few times and you watch The Girls of Camaret, you go and you watch something else that's subtitled, suddenly you're not trusting the subtitles anymore. And you are wondering, is this what they're actually saying? Because I think that's an interesting thing too, and the difference between what we have with The Crush versus Can Dialectics Break Bricks and then versus The Girls of Camaret, there was the redubbing of Can Dialectics Break Bricks. There was the French version of that. So what you're hearing is kind of making sense with the subtitles because you know enough French to be dangerous and can go, okay, that word matches up with that word. Then you watch The Girls of Camaret and it is still in its original Japanese and it is just the subtitling that is the detournement level. And so you don't know, that word doesn't match up with that word. And because I'm not nearly as versed in Japanese as I am with French. And then you watch something else and you don't know the language and you think, is that what they're really saying? And it's really interesting that it's suddenly making you question every single subtitled film that you watch.
That works that same way as Downfall, all those Downfall clips of, Hitler screaming.
And you're right. Some of those are 100% brilliant. There are some where you just watch it and your mouth is agape going, how can they do this? How can they fit this argument into this meme? And it's just wonderful. But I've noticed the downfall of Downfall over the last, say, 3-4 years. I don't see it enough. I don't see it as nearly as much. And I know memes have life cycles, but at the same time now when I watch it, it's Hitler critiquing something that Trump is doing, and it just brings this whole other level to it, and it almost makes me too uncomfortable because I'm pulling for Hitler now.
Yeah, that's not good. I just always like it when he complains about the innocuous shit. It just seems like the most ridiculous nonsense.
The ending of Lost.
Yeah, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, the ending of Lost, how fanboys were reacting against the Force Awakens. Yeah, there were so many good ones where it's just like, this is stupid shit that people are arguing about, and now here's Hitler reacting to something that is going on with this. And that was great. He was a great pop culture critiquer. But then, yeah, to use him now to critique something that Trump is doing is just, it adds one too many levels, and it just topples. All right, let's go ahead and take another break, and we're going to play a preview for next week's show.
Já não disse pra ir embora? É pra vender? Então tem que pagar imposto.
Não sabia que a prefeitura tinha uma parte do meu cevado. O que a mulher disse é mais. Aqui tem erro na conta.
Leve o seu dinheiro. E se não quiser, vá procurar emprego em outro lugar.
Vamos jogar um 31 lá dentro?
Pra acabar com isso.
That's right. We'll be back next week with an episode on Vidas Sikis. I think that's how you pronounce it. I do not speak Portuguese, sorry, as we begin a month discussing the Cinema Novo movement. Until then, I want to thank this week's co-host, Rob and Spencer. So, Spencer, what's been keeping you busy lately, bud?
You know, I teach at Northwestern, so I'm just finishing up this year of school. I felt like I dodged a bullet in a certain way because I didn't have full classes to teach remotely. But now I'm worried that when I have to return to teaching, and it looks like it's going to be remote, I'll be way behind. You know, this quarter has been very, very busy with like a lot of individual advising, and, you know, I can manage that. But it has been an interesting education in Zoom and Skype and FaceTime and what those technologies do to me in relatively short order. So where that has left me is now I'm just on a project of reading as much Philip K. Dick as I can possibly get my hands on.
And Rob, what have you been doing during your quarantine, sir?
Well, I've actually been in quarantine for quite a long time. I think this is the first time I've been on the show in like over a year, is it?
I think you're right. Yeah. It's been way too long.
So what happens in between projection booth episodes is I'm put into a block of ice, and I stay there until you come over and thaw me out with the blowtorch so that I can come and do these lovely commentaries.
That's because you've had the super soldier serum, and then you crash landed in the Arctic. Don't try to blame me.
Yeah, well, you know, I refuse to take responsibility. If you were listening before when I was on, I was finishing up work on the Detroit Punk Archive project. So the site's up now. I continue to add new information. And the record set has just become available, although I am down to like the final number of the black vinyl editions. I created 900 of the black vinyl editions. I have 100 of the color that I'm still waiting to arrive from the pressing plant, the color editions. And that is because of obviously the quarantine. So that shut down pressing operations for several months. So all of that is finishing, and I'm happy about that. That's been a long project. It's been about 2.5 years, and it's always great to talk about that. I've been doing some writing and trying to fix up the house that we bought and all that other fun stuff. So just life in general, and returned back to the world of radio news about a year ago, although I am considering new options in terms of what I'm going to do after that. So it is a period for me of much consideration and contemplation as I sort of figure out my place in the world, and if indeed dialectics can break bricks. Which I don't think, I guess the answer to that question, to the title of this week's show, is no. Is that what we get? You actually have to use your fist.
What is the URL for the Detroit Punk Archive, sir?
It is that, DetroitPunkArchive.com.
Holy cow.
It's amazing, and you can find it there. If you're interested in buying a copy of this 2LP masterpiece, you can get it at hfvinyl.com, which is Hold Fast. That's my label. And there's some available there. And of course, you know, I'm on the social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all that fun stuff. And it's always great to get a chance to talk to you, sir, and get a chance to meet new people such as Spencer. So thank you for having me on again.
Well, thank you so much, guys, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. Please head on over to the website, projectionboothpodcast.com, where you can find out more about today's episode. You'll also find a link over to Patreon, where you can make a donation to the show. And please let me say, podcasters of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains.
Snake eyes. The house wins.
You fought well yesterday. Your style is unorthodox, but effective. It is not the art, but the combat that you enjoy.
The winning.
Gotta hit me on the internet.
Headquarters.
All right, you ready for the real thing? You ready to come get it? You ready to come take it from your old man? You ready to be the king?
If you enjoy this show and want more people to know about it, head on over to iTunes, leave a comment, and rate it 5 stars. Make sure you like and share us on Facebook, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Just search for Christopher Media. Thank you in advance for supporting Christopher Media by clicking on the PayPal button and by clicking through to all the sponsors who support ChristopherMedia.net. Most importantly, we would like to take the time to extend an extra special thanks to you. Christopher Media could not exist without your support. Thank you for visiting ChristopherMedia.net, and thank you for listening. Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.